Welcome back to the University of Law podcast. My name is Jack Naylor and I'm a third year LLB law student studying at the University of Law on their Leeds campus. Though if you couldn't already tell, I am from Durham, the northeast of England. I'm currently about to finish my final assessments and I'm soon about to begin my job delivering PA support to the service management team within women's services at the Royal Infirmary Hospital in Edinburgh. So I'm about to speak to Charlotte, and we are here in light of Amnesty International Day, which is on the 28th of May. So Charlotte, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi Jack, hi everyone, and thank you so much for having me. So my name is Charlotte Alderson, and I am a children's solicitor and senior caseworker at a charity called Asylum Aid.
Yeah, so Charlotte, I'm going to ask you just a few questions regarding your work, and from the research that I've done, it seems to revolve quite a lot around human rights and significant national as well as international issues. Yeah, so I think the first question that I'd like to ask is, what's inspired you to get where you are now? So were there any key events in your life that have staged you to become a children's solicitor and children's caseworker at Asylum Aid?
So I knew my parents were international civil servants, so I was exposed to refugee issues from quite a young age, visiting refugee camps and things like that. So I think that from quite a young age, I knew that I wanted to do something that would make the world a better place, as cheesy as it sounds.
No, okay.
And kind of give back. Yeah, so I always had an interest in international work, but in particular in humanitarian work. I studied politics as an undergrad. I was also very lucky to do a master's in international studies and diplomacy, and had the opportunity, very luckily, to get professional experience at the Belgian Red Cross, UNHCR. And so that kind of confirmed that this was the area that I wanted to go into. And by this, I mean humanitarian work.
Yeah, it's definitely not a cliche. It does sound like you've had like these two strong figures in your life, like that helped, have this role into this work, and you've obviously worked so hard for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really did guide me that way. And it was I joined later when I finished my studies. I joined an organisation called the Interparliamentary Union, which works with Parliament specifically on development issues. And it was then that I thought I met a lot of lawyers. I worked with a lot of lawyers, and that made me think actually having legal qualifications would really help. So I went to what was then the College of Law, now University of Law, and did my GDL and LPC. I worked as a paralegal whilst doing my LPC. And I think if I had, when I thought at that point, would I actually practice law, the legal aid sector would have definitely been what I was drawn to. But I think like now, there were so many cuts. Finding jobs were really difficult. And I almost felt that we were not... It's hard to explain, but I felt that we kind of went and knew if you went down that route, things would be really difficult. So I thought I'm going to stick with my plan. I'm going to qualify and then go back to more humanitarian and development work. And that's what I did. I qualified and returned to that. I joined an organization called the International Development Law Organization. So it did have, of course, like a whole legal side to it. But it was there that I again got, I started really focusing in on refugee and migration issues. So in terms of my job today, I can say that there was a very specific moment that led me to it, in that I was sat in a conference. It was a UNHCR conference, and there were a lot of young refugees who had been asylum seekers as children. And there were two things that all of them kept saying in terms of their needs and what they would have wanted. And it was access to education and access to accessible and understandable legal representation, that, that they could really understand and that they felt they had ownership. And I just thought that, I'm a lawyer. That's the way that I can really make a difference. So I accredited, because you need to be accredited to give immigration advice. So I accredited as a senior caseworker. I knew I wanted to join Asylum Aid. I'd heard of them. I knew they worked with the most vulnerable people and that they were, really brought matters forward to try to change the system. I absolutely love my job, and I would say to people now that if you're studying and you feel that there's an area of law that you feel that you've missed the boat on doing, you haven't necessarily, you don't have to be pigeonholed. There are of course financial implications. You might have to take a bit of a career step back, but I mean, I qualified having mainly trained in family law, not in immigration and asylum, but you can make that move.
Do you have like any advice like for people who may be like having anxieties or been like, it's been feeling as though they have a narrow path to the career they want? You've obviously started to do so much with yours, and I think especially for me, just coming out of finishing my university degree, it can be quite daunting. So I don't suppose you have any advice for that.
Yeah, it's really difficult because I think so much pressure is put on you choosing this one route, and then you go down it forever, and you think, well, what if it's not for me? So I think you have to really give it careful thought. But if you've really thought about it and you think, well, no, actually, I don't know, I'm practicing criminal law and actually I really want to change to family. If you really thought about it and you really want to do it and you put a plan in action, you can make that change. Whereas I certainly felt that, it was a really big, and it is a big gamble, but you can do it. So just to try to be open and go for it.
I'll move on to the next question, which is, what does a typical workday look like for you?
So in terms of, it might help if I start by explaining a bit about what my role is. So my role as a children's solicitor is that I take on about 70% of children-related work in terms of casework, and then 30% are other matters. So adult asylum cases, family reunion cases, statelessness cases, things like that. And then when I talk about those percentages, they're very flexible. So they do have to vary because you might have one case that kind of suddenly erupts and takes over and the balance swings the other way. So it's not,
priorities.
Exactly. But kind of that's what we aim for. And then I also do some policy work. We are 2 children's solicitors at the moment at Asylum Aid. So we kind of work together and try to cover what we can in terms of non-casework issues. So I work with victims of trafficking, including children victim of trafficking. So that gives an idea of the nature of my role. In terms of typical day-to-day work, I spend a lot of time meeting with clients, taking clients' instructions. As I mentioned, the reality of the work is that I have to ask them questions about very difficult things that they've been through. And that means you have to be quite sensitive in terms of how they're coping with those questions. You have to be very flexible in terms of the lengths of meetings, breaks, especially working with children.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about.
Yes, you really have to see how they're managing and kind of picking up on signs. I work a lot with social workers, support workers. Working with children means you're not just there's the actual casework, but there's quite a bit of pro bono things and things like you've got to make sure that they remember to attend meetings, even sometimes reminding the people who are getting them to the meetings that they have to come to the meetings.
Yeah, got to be really attentive.
Yeah, so there's the whole client meeting side, which I think takes up quite a large portion of the day. And the way in terms of case management, I guess like most areas, work is that we're working to a lot of deadlines, home office deadlines and court deadlines. So there's that kind of guides what you're working on, and then setting aside non-client time to actually work on that, actually draft the representations. So in addition to drafting representations, you're doing things like if someone is willing to engage in therapy, making therapy referrals, instructing mental health experts, following up with Home Office for decisions. There is the authority that takes trafficking decisions, so either making representations to them or following up on those decisions. So it's very much a balance of meeting with clients to progressing cases, meeting deadlines, and then always organizing the next steps. We deal a lot with interpreters, so you kind of have issues where, will the interpreter show up? Will the client show up?
From someone who's obviously working within the field, you wouldn't know there's so many things that you have to like look over and make sure is like in place for these things. You obviously just work extremely hard.
Absolutely. And it's kind of like if one thing falls out, if you don't have an interpreter, you can't have a meeting. If you don't have the client, you can't have the meeting. And that can have an impact on your deadline and on the work you're preparing. So you do have to be quite flexible and organized, I think, like most solicitors.
Very true. Yes, obviously you do work extremely hard. So I just wanted to ask, what do you think has been the most rewarding moment or the biggest achievement within your career thus far? Obviously, you've still got so far to go and you just keep learning and growing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I think absolutely. I still feel like I have so much to learn and so much to do. I think for me, the biggest thing is always just getting a grant of refugee status for a client. It's not like a huge recognized award ceremony.
Nice that, your biggest achievements can come within like your day-to-day working day. That's so nice.
Yeah, I think you work so hard on cases. You see not only how vulnerable people are, but the trauma they've experienced, and then they have to go through such a difficult process. There are often so many delays. We have to get them to share details that they probably never want to think or talk about, and they're in desperate need of protection. So to finally get that security is so rewarding. I would say that I think it's difficult because you for me personally, I'm like, great, I've got what I can for them. I'm also really mindful that whilst on one side, I think that a lot of people think like everything will be okay once I get my status, then life will be so much better, because not knowing if you're going to be sent back somewhere where you fear for your life is obviously hugely unsettling, and it has a huge impact on people's mental health. I often feel at the end of the case, the reality, though, is that while this is undoubtedly a huge step forward, it doesn't mean that everything's going to be okay overnight. I know that it's not kind of like, okay, it's not like, okay, my job's fine. Oh, and you'll be fine now. You'll suddenly be able to sleep with no problems, and you won't be haunted by what's happening. I'm very conscious that in terms of the sector helping asylum seekers and refugees, everyone plays such an important part, and this is just one part. But it means that when we get that, I'm like, okay, well, at least I could do my bit to help. And it makes it all worthwhile, because of the energy I've put into it and the time.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, you've spoken about working with children as part of your role. I just wanted to ask you, what makes children so vulnerable and in need of specialised representation?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because we do at Asylum Aid, we really view our children work as being specialised. Children, I think, by their very nature, all children are vulnerable. And then if you look at the children that we're representing, they've experienced trauma. They're in a foreign country, they might not speak the language, and they're unfortunately in a position that they're having to ask for protection and safety. Often they're alone. So they are innately vulnerable. And I think that really, it does need specialized representation, because it means that it needs to be reflected in the way you work with them, the way you manage to get them to trust you and to share information with you, and that will allow you to prepare this case as strongly as possible. And I think that does take a different type of approach.
Yeah.
I think in a way there can be, some people could potentially look at it and think, well, these children have made it this far, so they must be incredibly resilient. But I don't think that makes them any less vulnerable. I think there's a bit like the misconception of, if you're a survivor or victim of trafficking, you probably won't be at risk of re-trafficking because you're aware of it. That's not true. In fact, if you are a victim of trafficking, you are at a higher risk of being re-trafficked. And I think that's the same with children. I think these children, the reality are they are more vulnerable because of what they've been through, and they'll struggle to advocate for themselves. And what we're effectively asking them to do is sit down with an unknown adult and ask them about awful things that have happened to them. So I think we really
need, like what you were saying before, like that you don't wake up the next day completely fine. Like, this is part of a long process.
Exactly. And most children, the reality is that they would rather be back home before any of what had happened to them. Do you know, they just want to be, like, most children just want to be back with their families, in a safe environment, and they miss, sometimes they come from very different cultures. It's a huge adjustment. So I think you really, we try to really take the time to take their instructions, try to make them feel as supported as we can. So, for example, if some children like to come with a support worker, so that they feel more supported, and that, we always check in terms of their mental health and if they're willing to engage in such support. Some children want to engage in support, others don't, and it's their decision. But kind of trying to get access for them if that is something that they would like.
So it's really apparent that children have varying levels of needs and wants and needs within the process. So I was just wanting to ask you what your thoughts and opinions on the challenges children and also vulnerable people, in fact, face in accessing legal representation and legal aid.
Yeah, I mean, the cuts in the legal aid, I think it effectively means children and vulnerable people can't get access to the legal representation that they need. I don't think that that's just about, in terms of asylum. I think that's really across the board. In asylum, I see it very clearly, not just in terms of, we're not just facing a backlog in terms of decisions at the Home Office, but I think the reality is that children simply can't find legal representation. It's taking them a really long time to get access to it. What that means in terms of the impact on that means that depending on who's assisting them, whether it's social services or a support worker in trying to find legal representation, or whoever their contact point might be from the Home Office, means that they might be pushed into situations where they're told to fill out forms that they need legal reps help with to do, and they're not getting it. They might be attending interviews without solicitors when they should have solicitors or a legal rep present. I think it's hard to say because some people might be pushing back and negotiating extensions and saying, look, we need to find this child a lawyer. We need to find them legal representation before things can move forward. But do I think that some children's cases are just going through? Yeah, I highly, I would be very surprised if I was told that no, every single child has a legal rep. I might be wrong, and that would make me very happy. But I worry that at the moment it means that not every child's claim for protection is being heard at its highest standard. And the reality of that is very serious. It means that children who are refugees aren't being accepted as refugees, and they won't get access to the protection they need. So yes, I think legal aid is a massive issue. a massive issue for both the clients and, of course, for the lawyers working in this area as well, because that we're all under a huge amount of pressure in terms of capacity, and that's very difficult.
Yeah, and do you think this has a negative impact on cases? Just as a side note, yes, you're saying that kids may not, hopefully, are getting this representation, but you're not 100% sure. Yeah, do you think that negatively impacts them later on?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, children not only have a right to legal representation, but they need it. I mean, to expect a child to present their claim for asylum, it's a hugely complex area of law in which, as adults, we need to be qualified. It's illegal to give immigration advice if you're not qualified. So to ask a child to present it, without legal representation is really difficult. But you see the waiting times, or how long children have been waiting. I really do worry about people that aren't having the access. Children aren't getting the access to legal representation they need.
Yeah, so we're essentially saying like how these issues go as far as to breach human rights. And I think that brings me nicely onto the next question, which is, given today's current political climate, which human rights are more susceptible to threats, do you think?
I think when I think about the European Convention on Human Rights, I think it's such a worrying time, because I find they're all facing serious threats. I mean, human rights are something that need to be protected and promoted. We can't. It needs constant action. It's not something that you say, oh, we've got our human rights, so we're done now, and no one will ever breach them. In terms of asylum, I mean, I think it's a really sad time. The UK has a very long history of welcoming refugees. Hundreds of years before the 1951 Refugee Convention was drafted, the UK was welcoming the Huguenots. And now we're in a position that the government has proposed an illegal migration bill, which by its very name, it says what it is. It is indeed an illegal migration bill. It's proposing an asylum ban. It not only goes against, in my view, what Britain's values are and what the UK stands for, but it's in breach of international law, including the 1951 convention. To me, it shows a real, it's an isolationist approach, lack of solidarity, and it's a dangerous and, quite frankly, terrifying precedent to set.
It is.
In terms of thinking about, human rights and what are, as you asked, what are being threatened. I also think in terms of, my area of work is particularly child focused, and I think the welfare of children. The Home Office has a duty to safeguard and promote the welfare of children in the UK, but we look at the way children are being housed, we look at the way children are going missing, and I mean, my view is that children are children regardless of where they come from. But circling back to this point that, we need to fight to preserve our human rights. All children need to be protected. If someone's listening to this and they think, well, actually, the children that you're talking about, unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, are different. They're different children. It doesn't concern us. I would say, well, look at our schools. What's happening to schools in the UK? What are happening to, resources at schools in the UK? And if they start to erode rights of one set of people, it will just keep coming. So we need to all work together.
What's concerning with the illegal immigration bill is that as of now, it's uncapped, and we could potentially see this happening to thousands of people. So it's just a minute issue. It does have the ability to almost go out of control.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe it is the illegal immigration bill, but maybe not. So in your opinion, which law revolving around asylum do you think needs urgent revision?
Yeah, so I'm absolutely against the illegal migration bill. In terms of what is already law, um, I would say, I mean, it's still so recent, but the Nationality and Borders Act 2022, to me, needs urgent revision, as well. It it changed the UK and asylum. It changed the UK asylum and trafficking systems, and not for the better. There's now differentiation of refugees, so you have Group 1 refugees and Group 2 refugees, and ultimately this has curtailed the rights of asylum seekers and victims of trafficking, and many are denied the protection and support that they need. I think that this law also increases the numbers of victims of trafficking that are risk of exploitation and real re-trafficking. I think both NABA and the Nationalities and Borders Act and the illegal migration bill are really a shame, because I think we would all agree that the system is broken, and it was such an opportunity to improve things. We could have all worked together if various sectors had really been consulted and really been listened to. There could have been really positive change. I think, bar traffickers, for example, no one wants people coming here on small boats. Do we really think that shutting the door and implementing an asylum ban will help the situation? Do we think it will really work? In my view, I can't imagine that someone who is trafficking children, who is exploiting them, is going to say to them, oh my goodness, I've just heard that if you were able to escape the exploitation and you tried to claim asylum, you wouldn't be able to. I feel really sorry for you. So actually, I won't exploit you in the UK. I'll exploit you in France. I just don't think that's realistic.
Yeah.
So in terms of this sector, recent and proposed legislation, it has been very challenging and is very challenging. And I think it's a shame when you think of the opportunities that have been missed to actually make things better. If I can talk also a bit about the government's Rwanda plan, as a very short summary, essentially the UK is giving Rwanda money, and it means that when people claim asylum in the UK can then send people to Rwanda to have their asylum claims processed. And if people are granted refugee status, they are granted refugee status in Rwanda. So effectively, people who are claiming asylum in the UK are having their claims processed in Rwanda. This means that people are being removed to Rwanda as a safe third country, even though there's evidence that it's not.
Yeah.
And there are really serious concerns about Rwanda's capacity to deal with asylum seekers. So Asylum Aid is arguing that the process of removing people to Rwanda is unfair. It means that people could be removed without effective legal advice, within very tight timeframes. I believe it is that people have only 7 days if they are in detention to make their case and get to court, and with no right to make representations on the general safety of Rwanda. So the High Court actually ruled that there was nothing unfair about the time scale, and that, individuals don't have the right to argue that Rwanda is generally unsafe, and they don't need to have a lawyer to make their case. This ruling was challenged. So the appeal was heard in the Court of Appeal earlier this year. We're now waiting for the judgment. But that's some of the action that Asylum Aid is taking against the government's Rwanda plan. And if anyone is
essential important work, really. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, and if I could just use it as a small bitch to say, if anyone is interested in supporting the campaign, we have if you just search Crowd Justice Asylum Aid, there's a funding page. And I realize that a lot of people are students, but even if you're not able to donate, if you're even able to just share our page, we would be immensely grateful.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's so nice to know that we can try and help as much as we can. Because I know myself, I only really know about this illegal migration bill and the government's attempt to send asylum seekers to Rwanda almost through like front page newspapers. Myself right now, I'm doing some research on it, doing a research project on the immigration rules where I've subsequently covered it. But I'd say before then, unfortunately, I only did know it from like head articles, headline news, which I think may bring us on to this next question, which is, so in this podcast, you might have raised, you evidently have, issues that listeners may have little awareness on. So do you think it's important that people are informed and aware of these current issues, and especially regarding claiming asylum in the UK?
Yes, I mean, I think what you touched on at the beginning is such a major issue, and I think that, I mean, because of the rhetoric at the moment and how the government is presenting things, there are so many misunderstandings and misconceptions about asylum seekers, and it is such a specialised area of work. So for the general public, it's really difficult, and I have to say, for professionals, it's very difficult and very frustrating. The definition of a refugee is very specific. Out of interest, I was just Googling the definition of refugee, and on Google, the definition is incorrect. So the numbers and vocabulary used are hugely inflammatory. And if you were to look at the UNHCR website at their figures, and you look at what other countries are doing to help, it really gives some perspective to actually what's happening in the UK. Why should people care? I like to think that most people are inherently good, and that if British citizens really knew and understood what was going on, they would like to do what's right. I sort of feel, I mean, I absolutely feel that shutting borders to the world's most vulnerable people is not the right thing to do. And I think when you put it really basically, and I know it's not like this, but if you had a child in one room and a child in another room, and there was a child to get through a door because a dog was chasing them, and you had a child shutting the door on them and trying to lock it, what would you be saying in that situation? And maybe this government wants our general attitude in society to say, sorry, this room is full, you're on your own. You know, what happens to you is your issue. I would hope to think that that's not what we feel, and I'd hope to think that, you know, that's not the approach that this country wants to take. I would say that even if you did have that approach, it also won't work. An isolationist strategy will do more harm than good.
Definitely.
So, you know, this strategy, I don't think it will work. It will waste people's time, money, energy, and I think it will impact us all. So I think it is really important that people are informed of the issues, as you say, more beyond the kind of front news headlines.
And then just finally, you kind of touched on this before, but it'd be nice just to summarise it and really emphasise it so that people can help as much as they can. So do you have any advice as to how people can stay informed on asylum issues and how they may potentially be able to help?
Yeah, so in terms of staying informed, there are things like, I mean, various organisations have legal updates. I know the Right to Remain, I believe they have legal updates. I know the Helen Bamber Foundation gives legal briefings and on their website. So that's a really good way to say, well, there's also a website called Free Movement, and they have, that deals with all matters relating to immigration, but it covers asylum. And they also have a podcast. Again, you'll get kind of everything to do with immigration. So if you might find yourself fast forwarding bits. It is an area that keeps developing. So you have to try to stay on top of it. In terms of what can you do to help? Well, I mentioned our crowd justice campaign, but I would also really urge people to sign the Stop the Illegal Migration Bill petition, which is on the UK Parliament website. Write to your MP. I'm not aware of any coming up at the moment, but, you know, if you see any protests, to attend protests, against the illegal migration bill, just to show that the government, that this isn't what people want. It's not where we're looking. Yeah, it's not where we're looking to put our taxpayers' money, and it's not representing the society that we live in. So yes.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. Hopefully listeners can then take this home with them, and they can too become informed and potentially help in every way that they can.
Thank you so much for having me. And I hope it's been helpful.